I'm going to be giving an introduction right now to Venerable Bhikkhuni Dhammadinna, who I'll be talking to in a moment. She is currently a visiting professor of Buddhist Studies at UC Berkeley with an ongoing appointment as Associate Research Professor at the Dharma Drum Institute of Liberal Arts in Taiwan. She is the co-founder with Bhikkhu Analayo and the director of the Agama Research Group at the Dharma Drum Institute, where she publishes and promotes research on early Buddhist texts. Native to Italy, she received her doctorate from the University of Naples, L'Orientale, in 2010, and she now serves as a Buddhist minister with the Italian government through the Italian Buddhist Union. She was ordained as a nun in Sri Lanka. We are honored to have you, Venerable Dhammadinna. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Miles, for having me here.
Yeah, of course. Well, as a way of starting our conversation, I wanted to give listeners just a quick sense of the range of your work and where your vocation has taken you geographically and historically. To me, I guess the question is, with all of this breadth, and especially this breadth early in your career, right, where you have Central Asia in play, you're doing language study in Sanskrit and Tibetan, you are traveling to East Asia in Japan and Taiwan, and then you're ordained in Sri Lanka, you're getting surely such a sense of the diversity and variety of Buddhist studies, and trying to figure out what your own specialization is going to be within that. So I wonder just how that informed your work at the time, how you look on it now as a specialist, and I just thought I would ask that first.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is just like an organic or like natural reflection of really, the routes taken by the Buddhist transmission in textual transmission and institutional transmission. So I think I just allowed myself to, to kind of follow it through in a way. And so it's not that, I don't know, I think Buddhist studies is inherently like this.
Yeah.
So it's I don't see it as kind of, like my special case, but it was just like more coming from this recognition of the fact that you can't do Buddhist studies without really acknowledging this variety and seeing, diversity and also, like all these text historical developments, going. So I think it's just, ideally, of course, you can have like scholarship which is very detailed and vertical, and then you may have more breadth. Hopefully, I don't end up being like a jack of all trades and master of none.
Right.
That's kind of risk too. But I think in a way, in the 21st century, we do need to face this. To confront this kind of breadth and to have like an overall sense of the direction of these traditions.
Yeah, and I really like the original insight that there's something there about following a transmission history that is just part of the history of the religion. And I guess I wonder about that it, I'd imagine in those various travels and in that scholarship, you're not always going chronologically, as it were, from the origins to its most contemporary manifestations. In some ways, in fact, at times it seems as though you're going backwards, right? You're starting in the middle period and then you're working your way back to early texts. Does that reading backward, as it were, or moving backward and forward in time allow a certain perspective as you're working?
Yeah, I have to say I'm really impressed, that like a non-specialist in Buddhist studies is, already has this perspective on the history of the discipline of the field, and also moving through that. Yeah, personally, I do come. Maybe this is also like my Italian conditioning or this kind of grammar school background. We get drilled in with this idea that you have to have like a text historical perspective. So I think this is also like part of my like background in a way.
Yeah.
So it's kind of natural to have this sense of history and text historical development and institutional history and ideological history. So I think it comes from there to an extent. And also I think it's kind of natural, at least for me it's been natural, to observe what goes on around me and to, see through certain dynamics in the light of, this very Buddhist principle of, dependent arising and conditionality and historical, kind of the impact of historical conditions on ideas and individuals and communities. So I think it's not like an intentional going back and forth, but it's more like a type of a way of looking at things, and I couldn't escape from that in a way.
That makes sense. And so there's a lot of work that must go into every one of those moves intellectually and just geographically to kind of get your bearings and figure out what the context is that you're working with.
Yeah, and then you have also like the language, things to work out, because of course you do need to read the primary sources, I mean, to the best of your ability. So
Right.
I'm not like a trained, sinologist as such, or a trained, Tibetologist, like, doing heavy work in Tibetan, for example.
Yeah.
But you do need to have like direct access to
Right.
heavy duty work.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
So for the Agama Research
Yeah.
Group, if you want to be able to access that
Yeah.
side of early Buddhist texts, you need to have some access through your collaborators or through your own work to Chinese, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in a way you do have to, surrender to the fact that you are not going to be, like the perfect Indologist or the perfect Sinologist or the perfect Japanologist,
Yeah.
To the service of having this broader picture. But
Right.
also I think you have to be honest, I mean, and recognizing your own limitations. So maybe you do own, or at least, you try to build some sort of, deeper knowledge and understanding of, within at least one main field, with
Right.
all the language and philology, etc. And then, I mean, there is collaboration for that.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think if you do know the extent of your ignorance, it's kind of, I mean, it's easy in a way to also be a bit more careful. And so if you're warned about the limitations of your own tools, then, it's epistemically acceptable, so to say, to do these excursions,
Right.
outside your field. If you just I mean, you end up being so conceited that I mean, you don't know the kind of, limitations of your own knowledge. Of course, then it ends up, very flat or,
Yeah.
just, I mean, wrong, really.
Yeah.
So I think it's also like negotiating, this curiosity and wish to, to look at other things and knowing your limitations, really.
Right. So it does sound like there's a balance there, that on the one hand, you use this language, this kind of humble language of limitations and ignorance, and worry about that the opposite pole might be conceit. But I guess I wonder if there's a different pole, as it were, of advantage, of inciting collaboration because you need it, or seeking out some kind of comparativist move because that's the thing you come with, or if it's just a matter of having a slight unfamiliarity with a subject that allows you to see it in a way that those who are doing the kind of deep, expert, vertical study of something might not have. Has that ever been the case?
In the way I put it, it's more like, I mean, you begin to recognize the impact of so many different conditions on textual transmission, textual formation, and reception, and, I mean, with the text, also the contents of the text. So in a way, if you really have to acknowledge the impact of these conditions, which is anyway also what traditional, philology has been doing,
Right.
Way before, this kind of arising of Buddhist philology as a subfield.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, to the extent that you recognize the impact of so many different, aspects, you do have, to have a methodological dialogue with, other areas and fields which are actually working with those conditions and studying those conditions.
Right.
So I think it's really like, this multidimensional. So we just try to look at the same phenomenon from multiple angles. Sorry, my pronunciation might be wrong. So from multiple angles, and so again, I see it as just as a reflection or as a demand of the materials we are working with,
Yeah.
and this, like human phenomena we
Yeah.
are working with.
Yeah, so there will always be this nice overlayering of the experience of the scholar who's trying to move maybe between languages and traditions, and just the experience of the scripture or of the material itself, having
Yeah,
also
yeah.
been brought up that way, as it were. That's great. You mentioned something in passing earlier that I wanted to touch back on, which is the feeling of also maybe having glimpses of this history when you're there now. Is that, if I caught that right, that like by nature of having traveled to all these places, and as we will get to, also being a practitioner in this religion, I guess I wonder, have there been moments for you where you've been able to perceive elements of that context, elements of particular tradition, things that may be taken for granted on the ground that for you were really striking when you kind of arrive on the scene, where you say like, oh, I
Yeah.
know this happened in this century, I can see it happening now here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, I mean, as a Buddhist practitioner and monastic, this academic background has been, really like a protection in a way, and like a safe haven, from the impact, for example, I mean, as a female monastic, of terrible discrimination in the Theravada world. I mean, by the way, I'm ordained in the Theravada tradition, which
Right.
is one of the like contemporary living Buddhist traditions. So I think having this perspective, you know, for once you see this kind of long kind of tide of, you know, kind of historical kind of developments. And so your own sense of agency somehow, you know, is perceived in a totally different way, you know, vis-a-vis like a person who simply, I mean, I'm not saying simply in a kind of, you know, diminishing way, but, you know, if you're fully identified with your religious persona in a way, so all your eggs are in that basket, so to say, and so you don't have this metacognition, you know, of your own kind of agency within that kind of context. So in a way, I think, I mean, I've been, you know, vaccinated by my, you know, academic understanding because things hurt less in a way on the personal level, or at least you also you know, see through things in a different way.
Yeah.
Instead of having, you know, invested 100% into building a religious identity without this kind of, you know, meta-awareness or metacognition, so to say.
Yeah.
So I think that this has been really extremely helpful, I mean, on a very personal, like, existential level.
Yeah.
And this also ties in with the kind of talk we're going to have this evening.
Later this evening, right.
And also in general, I really think that seeing, you know, like the long tide of history, it's so helpful. You know, it's just also so helpful to kind of also disengage from this, you know, monocausal kind of understanding of religious phenomena, because you really see the kind of, you know, multiple conditions. Again, you know, coming back to this conditionality topic, you know, you see the impact of different things. So it's not new. And I mean, for example, you know, with this neuroscience, you know, thing. I mean, we had a little conversation before, you know, the recording, so I can just pull you know, pull it out. You know, like Miles used this word. Oh, what kind of? I mean, I'm not quoting verbatim, but it was like, what kind of pernicious things you see in this, you know, misappropriation, something like that. And you know, this kind of clickbait thing. But you know, I actually it's interesting because I don't see it as pernicious, but you just see that this rewriting, you know, of new canons and you know, redetermination of the tradition has already happened in history. So you don't come from like a judgmental position. And I'm not now advocating for being non-judgmental, you know, per se, but somehow you don't have this kind of moralistic or traditionalist kind of standpoint, and the idea that, you know, you have to defend tradition at all costs. But rather you're also aware, I mean, of your own conditioning actually there. So in a way, I mean, of course, I mean, as a Buddhist practitioner, I do feel, you know, there is something which is inconsistent there, but I do think again.
Sorry,
that
could you say more inconsistent?
Oh yeah, like, you know, in certain kind of trends in this kind of contemporary, basically deployment of, you know, meditation states for research in neuroscience, which is not fully informed by the, you know, paradigmic to the Buddhist tradition. So I mean, it's not a traditionalist position. It's just that you need to, you know, to have like a full dialogue with the other partner. So you have to take the dialogue, the conversation partner fully on board. So of course, I mean, as a Buddhist practitioner, I might react to that in a way. But actually, this academically informed understanding of my own sense of being, of self, does help with, you know, coming up with an interest, you know, so let me understand what's going on here, rather than this kind of, you know, black and white traditionalist or, you know, outraged textual scholar kind of thing. So I think that there is a lot of scope for actually having like a wider, you know, perspective, wider perspective. And,
and that's a great way of putting it. And I think what I was seizing on there was the opportunity to think, oh, here is a potential critique, you know, from kind of purely within the discipline to someone who's maybe outside of it, but rather to think about it in terms of a curiosity, maybe, to think that like, oh, that allows you one more way of being broad-ranging in your research, to take an interest in what others are doing, and, you know, maybe to critique, maybe to correct, but so as to kind of understand what it is that they're working on and then contribute to it. Does that sound right?
Yeah. And I mean, I also think, and here I am advocating for, you know, for Buddhist scholarship or on behalf of Buddhist scholarship. I think it's also time, you know, to emerge from this Orientalist or, you know, colonialist paradigm, so that, you know, if we are dealing with, I don't know, Buddhist constructs, we do need to have an informed and the text historical informed understanding of these Buddhist constructs. So you can't have research in neuroscience on mindfulness in general or on a certain state, because these states are actually controversial within tradition itself. So to say, if you are willing to have like such a complex and nuanced methodological approach within your own field as a scientist, let's put aside now, you know, the ideology of, you know, science vis-a-vis religious studies and all of that. But anyway, if you're willing to be, you know, epistemically like solid in your own field, you do have to grant that kind of position and integrity also to the so-called object you are analyzing. Otherwise, you're just reifying it, and this object, happens to be, like a living body. By the way,
Let me turn to something that you brought up, and that, of course, I think is a fascinating part of your biography to many listeners, which is the dual identity of being a scholar and a practitioner. And one way that you talked about it was to say having the academic perspective means that when you go into various contexts, it gives you potentially a kind of distance or maybe an objectivity or at least a kind of mode of assessing things that might otherwise be difficult or unpleasant or just disorienting, perhaps. And I just kind of wanted to go along that line and think about it a little bit. So what does that mean for your interactions, on the one hand, with other scholars when coming in as a nun, and I guess what seems more pertinent to that particular story is then talking to other nuns and monks or practitioners coming in as the academic?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think it gives me like an objective stance, but perhaps more an understanding of the fabrication of my own subjectivity there. So I think just this sense of being aware of what you bring with you into the discussion, and having. So I mean, I used to feel when I was younger, that I was like neither one thing nor the other. I was like neither a scholar nor a practitioner or nor a monk. And now, like maybe getting old, it's kind of getting more integrated. So actually now I feel, oh, wow, you know what? I belong to both worlds. So it's actually a much more comfortable place. And also, of course, also when you're younger, when you are, like maybe less mature. I'm not claiming I'm mature now, but somehow I think, the sense of identity becomes more divisive in a way, and you kind of cling more strongly, to either side. So you play like, the kind of scholar with practitioners, and you kind of, and then you play the practitioner with scholars in a way. But somehow I think you can really have this kind of double identity, together, if you're not clinging so strongly, to this kind of righteousness about, one standpoint.
Right, where there could be that temptation on either end to say that there's a certain kind of purity of this field or that identity. So could we talk about the two directions then? So for instance, being a practitioner among scholars and maybe bringing that into your scholarship, what might that look like as a teacher or a writer?
I don't know, it feels so natural that I don't
well, but it sounds like it wasn't always natural, is that right?
Yeah, I don't have a meta-narrative of them now. But I think, going personal, it's like, for me, it's more like you can be yourself more. So maybe when you are like not fully confident, maybe, or you are feeling threatened, or you are like, you just lack the sense of personal integrity, you end up having two different personas, in two different fields, or it's like a bit when, like when you have your own self with your parents, and then you have your own self with your friends, But like slowly, I really see it, like with kind of with time, these two things kind of come together. So I feel a stronger sense of integrity in a way, and and it's less about playing that or that. It's just this is what I am now.
Right.
So I'm actually happy to have come to this kind of place of more integration compared to this kind of more conflicted sense of being not quite knowing where you're placing yourself in a way.
That makes sense. So one thing we talked about when we met before this interview was a little bit about how this might manifest specifically in teaching. You've got a seminar right now at Berkeley on Buddhist texts, and then you mentioned you were kind of getting more into Dharma teaching recently. So I wonder about, I'm somebody who cares a lot about teaching in particular, and I imagine a number of our listeners might as well. What is those seem like they have to be, by discipline, kind of fundamentally different ways of doing instruction, and for different ends and for different purposes. But now you're at this place perhaps where you feel like an integrated double self in both of those contexts. So does that change what a classroom or a gathering looks like in either of those contexts?
This kind of seminar setting, I think is quite interesting, because I feel, well, for once it's like work in progress, so everyone is included, and I think maybe the kind of contribution that comes from Buddhist practice is that you are less, or comparatively less kind of anxious about delivering. It's more like I'm enjoying very much the process, with colleagues and students, And I mean, if I screw it up, I screw it up. It's okay. You know, I mean, of course, you know, I mean, it's not always okay. I mean, you may feel embarrassed, but somehow I feel that, you know, there is a place of self-confidence, you know, in the kind of, you know, in your honest attempt at, you know, doing your academic work and doing your, you know, I mean, and living with some kind of coherence or consistency. So there is a different sense of, I feel like, confidence that doesn't come from having to have the intellectual package or the professional package all completely sorted out.
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, I also know that I can say this because honestly, I do put the work in, you know, in textual work. So it's not just, you know, like fluff. You know? So I think this is actually interesting for me. And I see that the students, they might not, you know, be practitioners or anything like that, but on the human level, I do feel, you know, maybe if anyone is going to listen to our interview and was in the seminar, maybe they have a different opinion. But I do feel that there is some kind of human kind of connection there. And there is this sense of ease around that, and so it creates actually space, you know, for looking at things, you know, with curiosity and with really investigating things and not having to perform.
Right.
So this, I think, this lessening of the kind of performance urge is quite, you know, if you embody it genuinely, I think it's also like an example for, you know, for like young, you know, younger students and
who might be tempted to posture in some way. Absolutely, that makes sense. So then conversely, when you're with members of the Sangha, are they curious about things that you're publishing academically? Do you bring in some of the things that you are currently on your mind in terms of your research in those kinds of contexts?
Yeah, I think more and more, actually, there is more opening to, you know, academic studies and cross-fertilization and all of that in the Sangha over the last, you know, few years. I mean, in Taiwan, of course, I mean, in the Chinese world, this kind of literacy, Buddhist literacy in the Sangha is already, like, established, so it's taken for granted there. It's a totally different kind of, you know, background and kind of, you know, historical trajectory. As far as, like, so-called Westerner or Westerners, or let's say, you know, like modern, postmodern, contemporary, urbanized elites, or, you know, whichever kind of category historically we want to kind of bring up. I think there was a lot of like anti-scholastic, anti-doctrinal kind of preconceptions.
Why is that?
I think it's just a result of the transmission of the Dharma to, you know, to the West, and particular kind of strands of Buddhist ideology that have become dominant. And I think it's also part to do with this, you know, celebration of subjectivity and, you know, my own truth and this kind of, you know, epistemic kind of positioning. So there was, I mean, a lot of that, and it's changing. I find it's changing. So maybe it's like second, third, fourth wave, I don't know. But somehow I think there is a lot more interest in understanding the texts and the teachings as they have been, you know, historically transmitted, and there is less kind of dogmatism in, you know, other ways, so less dogmatic stances. This is what the Buddha said, you know, period, and or this is what my, you know, kind of trustworthy subjective experience says. So I find a lot more balance and openness. So it's actually a lot easier to have these conversations now than maybe like 20 years ago or 15 years ago. It's changed a lot, actually.
Do you have a sense of where it might go from here? Do you think that's a tendency that might continue to move in that direction of integration, or are there risks that it wouldn't?
Yeah, this is a kind of complex question in a way, I think, because with this whole, you know, jeopardizing of, you know, of truth in this country and in the contemporary world in general, I think we are beyond, you know, this fact-checking already, and we are beyond, you know, assertions of truth, which is foundational to you know, to Buddhist discourse. So I think in a way, I mean, the Buddhist traditions, the living Buddhist traditions, they are living entities, so they are definitely going to be, you know, influenced by what goes on culturally, you know, in general. So I do see that this sense of, you know, delegitimization of truth this is beyond just, you know, non-factual truth. It's kind of a much deeper, you know, level of delegitimization of actually, you know, making truthful statements or reality. So I think in a way, actually, the Buddhist traditions do have, you know, interesting tools to offer in this kind of conversation. But on the other hand, you know, the impact of these, you know, ideologies, I mean, it's going to make itself.
It could be corrupting or poisonous in a way. Could you say more about the tools of where you feel Buddhism might have a role to play or be useful?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you know, the baseline practice of mindfulness shared by all Buddhist traditions. it's a great tool. It doesn't carry, truth value in itself. It's not that it aligns
Right.
with wisdom in
Right.
itself, but it definitely enables, the person or groups or communities in this attempt at, like looking closely at your own, biases. So it's not that mindfulness is not biased or is kind of objective.
Or that it's dredging up propositions and
Absolutely,
facts.
and
Right.
I'm not subscribing to this in a kind of positivistic, understanding or construct of mindfulness, but it definitely gives tools, to pause and to self-reflect. So probably this is actually, I think, one of the strongest, most powerful tools that can be adopted from the Buddhist perspective, and yeah.
That's fascinating and
Yeah.
worth thinking about. So in terms of the specific work that you're doing, so much of your research recently and your position with the Agama group in your various roles has to do with specifically collecting, translating, interpreting, analyzing early Buddhist texts. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of after having had all of that breadth and having seen Buddhism from all these different temporal, geographical dimensions, how you gravitated toward that study and what it has brought to light for you?
Yeah, actually, that was my interest when I started, my Buddhist practice. But back then I had no real understanding of what like Theravada Buddhism was about, or so-called early Buddhism was about, or it was all very vague, And this was like pre-internet era, and in southern Italy, so it was extremely exotic, I mean, like the first kind of Sanskrit grammar book I had was in Latin, from the local library. So it's a totally different world. I mean, it's like I feel extremely old, in this kind
You're
of
just taking whatever was available and
Yes,
doing the sorting later.
So I had no idea whatsoever, and so, just again, conditions, and also, just personal encounters, with scholars and teachers who were actually doing, like Khotanese Buddhism, for example,
Right.
which was my PhD project. So I had a lot of respect and trust and admiration for my teacher, and so this was also like an impactful factor for me, going that direction. But this was like always my interest, throughout.
Yeah.
And then finally I was, really, I mean, very lucky actually, in having, the right conditions in Taiwan for going back to this field. And Taiwan, I mean, Taiwanese kind of Buddhist scholarship has like a long tradition in this field.
Yeah.
So I think it was very supportive. I mean, the environment was extremely supportive for that. And I think, maybe the outcome of all of this kind of circling around and about is really, this sense that even, so-called early Buddhism or, early Buddhist texts or thoughts, this is absolutely also, just like an artifact, this is the result of philological practice. So it's not that now I'm, claiming that this is what the Buddha taught or thought. And then here you'll have to work it out with my accent, what I mean, so teaching and thinking. So we are not really, in that position to make, claims like that. And this is not the verbatim record of the Buddha's teachings. So I think this understanding that this just, this like human phenomena, religious phenomena, they are like that, and just so taking on board, this, uncertainties that we also have, over. I think it's also very helpful, and you, I mean, I feel I'm far less dogmatic than I used to be as a result of all this trajectory of, having to, kind of really study all these different traditions and, back and forth, etc. So you really see the historicity of all of this. And so I think this is, I mean, for me, this is like the main takeaway.
Yeah.
So like lessening this kind of, dogmatic stance
Right.
over the teachings as a practitioner.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I'm thinking a little bit over the corpus of the writings of yours that I've gotten to know, where you've written about the nature of giving and sacrifice as basic principles, maybe the first instance of the chariot simile, and a rebuke of Mara. You've written about sex change within one life as a kind of metamorphosis, and then and rebirth across the sexes, and ways in which those kinds of scriptures are then reinterpreted in later periods. Is there a particular project that comes to mind for you when you think about learning about that historicity, or having some kind of personal insight?
Yeah, actually, I mean, this ties up with what I was saying earlier. So this study I did on the chariot simile, so this is like a very famous, very well-known simile in Buddhist literature. So it's about so-called relative truth and so-called ultimate truth. So it's like, are the components of a chariot, the same thing as the chariot? So there is this kind of just nominalist thing about calling an entity, like if the functional assemblage of something a chariot. So where is, what's the kind of the truth there, or the so in Buddhist thought, there's been this very early probably arising of this construct of two truths, so the relative and truth and ultimate truth spelled out in different ways in different texts. I mean, this is like hyper, over simplification.
Sure, that's
simplification.
helpful.
But anyway, and so most Buddhist, well, all living Buddhist traditions, they basically operate taking this construct for granted, and this is also part of mainstream, Buddhist discourse. Sometimes, it's brought in, oh, this is just conventional truth, and as if, there was like subscribing only to conventional reality vis-a-vis the ultimate, etc. And I mean, sometimes it's also been used, to defend or support institutional, violations, etc. Because it's like in the name of, relative truths,
I see.
things are, and etc. And so what I'm interested in right now is actually finding out how this construct has arisen in Buddhist thought and in Buddhist texts, because we have basically the absence of any such a kind of dichotomic understanding of truth or principles of truth in the early layer of the text, and then we have this fully fledged construct which is kind of found everywhere in Buddhist sutra literature, so discourse literature. It's everywhere in scholastic literature, etc.
Yeah.
So right now I'm trying to work on this topic, and I find this is quite relevant to this whole postmodern truth discourse.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting for me to see how this very foundation, the kind of epistemic foundation for
Mm-hmm.
the Buddhist teachings has been also going through major ideological changes within Buddhist traditions themselves.
Is there anything you can tell us that might be useful to us in our own era about a historical moment where the concept of relative truth suddenly becomes apparent, and then when it becomes, as it were, ossified as the new dogma? Or yes.
I wish I knew. I'm still working on it.
Yeah.
I'm working on it, but definitely this move towards more scholastic, boxed kind of descriptions and models. So this has had an impact. So within this kind of classificatory thrust that the Buddhist tradition started to take, you do need to allocate things to this or that, box.
Category.
And so this is, I think this is like part of like a larger movement towards scholasticism and towards classification and description rather than mere normativity, etc. So it's all part of like a bigger movement which led to the arising, for example, of the Abhidharma traditions or other constructs.
Well, could I ask you just by way of closing perhaps to say a couple words about what listeners and viewers might see at the lecture tonight? Would you like to say just a little bit?
Oh, yeah. So maybe you know the title better than I do. But anyway, the idea is that I'll be sharing some, like findings or reflections on this whole theme of the revival of the Bhikkhuni Sanghas, of the fully ordained female monastic community in the Theravada tradition, which is the monastic tradition I was ordained in. And I'm particularly looking again at institutional history, so at legal ideologies involved in this revival, which is sometimes not part of the discourse, because you do need to have a certain sensitivity for this kind of topics, and it's also not part of the explicit discourse that you find in modern Buddhist circles. It
sounds like in any case there's some things there that'll be topical for things that we've been talking about between the scholastic and the subjective, between the two identities that you've been pulling together, and a kind of historical view and a contemporary view of how Buddhism has manifested itself today.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. I'm looking forward to that. I'm sure others are looking forward to that. And, well, thank you very much, Venerable Dhammadinna. It's been wonderful to talk to you and learn a little bit about your life, your practice, and your scholarship. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Miles, also for really doing the homework, the Buddhist homework, before our conversation. Yeah, it's really impressive, and I really appreciate it.
It was fascinating reading,
Thank
and I
you.
encourage others to go and read it as well.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you.